Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me along today to present to you. First part of the talk, I'll talk about some of the big overarching conclusions from the scientific consensus statement from the sediment particulate nutrient theme, but then I'll move into a bit more of relevance for the Burdekin. So we'll zoom into the Burdekin and have a look at, what it means for the Burdekin and some of the solutions we have for the Burdekin. First up too, I'd like to acknowledge there were 15 co-authors that contributed across 6 different questions in the sediment theme here. So I'd just like to acknowledge them there on the screen there as well. So just touching through the theme, there were 6 questions. The first 2 that I'll describe really looked into largely the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon, and then the other 4 covered the catchment sort of sediment story. So first up, I looked at the spatial and temporal distributions of land-derived sediments in the water column and on the seafloor. Then we had Kath Collier led the chapter looking at the impacts of land-derived sediment. And then the land themes, we had Ian Prosser cover quantifying the characteristics and sources of the sediment. Then we had Scott Wilkinson that looked at the drivers of the sediment loads and the changes over time. Then we had Rebecca Bartley that looked at the effective management practices. So this was specifically around different industries, particularly with the grazing focus, but other areas as well, looking at the cost variability and production outcomes. And then finally we had Andrew Brooks, who looked at the effectiveness of the gully and streambank restoration, the variability of the costs and production outcomes. So that was a summary of the questions. Now I'm going to give a very broad summary of all of that work, but each question covers an enormous amount of literature, so 850 studies all up, and I'd encourage you to go directly to the question to have a look at all the different components of that work. So here's a summary, overarching summary of the theme in 3 points, which is really condensed down. We know, and I don't think anybody's going to dispute that, the export of fine sediment particulate nutrients have increased since the arrival of Europeans in the catchment, and they're very in the order of 1.4 to 5 times higher than pre-development rates. And that really, that doesn't really reflect the uncertainty in our numbers, that really reflects the variability from basin to basin. The increased delivery of land-based fine sediment reduces the quality and quantity of light reaching the benthic organisms and has impacts on inshore seagrass meadows and coral reefs, which are dependent on the light. Management is most effective when targeted to sediment and particulate nutrient hotspots, and they occur in all different land uses and all different erosion process types, so hill slope, gully and streambank erosion. The main sources of sediment in the Great Barrier, going to the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon is really based on, and I'll talk about anthropogenic sediment here, is from grazing lands, simply because grazing has the biggest area, 73% in the catchment area, although we do see localised hotspots from other industries that will generate very high yields of sediment, but from a relatively small area, so on a relative scale, smaller loads. The main drivers of the anthropogenic sediment particulate nutrient exports were overgrazing, land clearing, tillage and other soil disturbances. And a lot of this can go back into legacy issues such as legacy mining in the catchment and legacy grazing practices that occurred a long time ago. So the modelling and observations show that half the sediment export comes from gully erosion and the remaining half is split equally between streambank and hill slope erosion. So gully on average across the whole Great Barrier Reef catchment area, but will vary from basin to basin, on average 50%, hill slope 25% and streambank 25%. And much of the export comes from quite small areas, so this gives us encouragement for solutions where we can invest in small areas of the catchment. So for example, in the Bowen catchment, 30% of the fine sediment load comes from of the gully erosion, which is one of the big contributors in the Bowen catchment, comes from just 2% of the gullies. So it allows us to start prioritising these hotspot sources. So now moving into the Bowen Burdekin story, so I'm going to give you a bit of a mini Burdekin sediment story. The Burdekin's the single largest contributor of fine sediment to the Great Barrier Reef. It contributes about 40% of the total load, or on average, 3.6 million tonnes. But talking about averages in the Burdekin is a bit silly. You know, it ranges from virtually nothing in a dry year up to about 16 million tonnes, I think we've measured in quite a wet year. So, in summary, conceptually, it's estimated the loads increased by 5 times since the arrival of Europeans in this sort of recent period. That's supported by a lot of different evidence, including monitoring data, modelling data, coral core data, sediment core data offshore, and we've also started to get some catchment erosion tracing studies as well. And I will say there is that prior to the Burdekin Falls Dam, that increase in loads was probably more in the order of 8 to 10-fold. So the trapping of sediment in the Burdekin Falls Dams reduced that load since. We've done a lot of monitoring of Burdekin River flood plumes, including a pretty recent tracing study, and it shows that it's really the fine sediment fraction that's less than 20 micron that travels the furthest in the Great Barrier Reef Lagoon. So this sediment we can trace hundreds of kilometres offshore back to a catchment area in the Burdekin. The coarser fractions, and including a proportion of this less than 20 micron fraction, so it's not all a less than 20 micron fraction that just completely goes, some of it's also deposited near the mouth as well. And finally, it's this fine sediment that travels the furthest that influences water quality in the inshore Great Barrier Reef Lagoon and also possibly the middle shelf, but that one is a bit of a gap that we still need some more monitoring data for. So this newly delivered sediment creates like a bit of a fluffy layer on the sediment floor, and it takes a while to work out of the system. So it might compact on the seafloor, get transported into deeper water, or transported into mangroves and get deposited in there. And that takes about 6 months of time. But in that period, it's highly active and more easily resuspended and reduces water clarity. And then that influences the light available for seagrass meadows and coral reefs. Conceptually, if we want to have a look at this from a satellite image, we can see this is a plume from the Burdekin in 2011, which is quite a big flood event, typical big flood event in the Burdekin. You see this, it's going to work. You can see this area around the plume, highly turbid sediment. As that's dropping out, we start to see the plume moving north, and we can see that that water turns green. And that's where I'd argue this is the new nutrients coming to the shelf, causing that microalgal bloom and making those nutrients more bioavailable. And I think from our observations, we don't really see this green water following resuspension events.
I'll make a comment about that later.
Okay. So conceptually here, we know most sediment falls out at the mouth here. So in the order of the Burdekin, from the monitoring we've done from a big river flow system, about 80% of the sediment load from the Burdekin falls out and is pretty much retained at the mouth. It doesn't really go very far. It doesn't get reworked. But it's a sediment that's transported up further into our further northward bays, so Cleveland Bay, Halifax Bay, as it moves off the coast. What's that sediment look like? And it actually looks quite a bit different to the sediment that's come out of the river. But the sediment in the river is still there. So this is what we call a sediment flock. And you can see this translucent material is the organic rich sediment that's being formed from sort of the nutrients in the system and probably being used as a nucleus of the terrigenous, the land-based sediment. But what we see here is this opaque particles in here, nice rounded particles. They're the sediment that was originally in the river mouth, and this is the less than 20 micron fraction. It ranges back in size from about 1 to 20 microns. And that's the material that's travelling the furthest, and that's influencing our water quality or water clarity for the time afterwards. So if we move into the health of our seagrass meadows in Cleveland Bay, and the seagrass meadows in Cleveland Bay is one of the most important seagrass meadows south of the Torres Strait, really important habitat for turtles, dugongs, and our inshore fisheries. We can see there's quite a, this is the Marine Monitoring Program data published recently in the Outlook report, and we can see this is just the seagrass condition score. We can see that big decline in sort of the late noughties. It recovered very well in terms of the condition of the area, but I'll show you some biomass that suggests maybe slightly otherwise. But then since the 2019 floods that we had, the big floods in Townsville and the Burdekin, we still really haven't got back up to that previous condition. And another nice illustrating this spatially is this, the 2007, 2008, 2009, 10 and 11. We can see those different colours represent different types of seagrass, different species of seagrass, but basically that represents the whole area of seagrass. And you can see after the big floods of the Burdekin in 2007, 2008, 2009, 3 consecutive big floods, we start seeing that area of the seagrass meadow contract from the deeper water into the shallower water. And then, of course, in 2011, we had very, very big flooding coupled with tropical cyclone Yasi, which cleaned up the shallow seagrass. And the knock-on effects from that, we had very little seagrass in our whole broader area, and we started seeing pretty much very large strandings of dugongs and turtles on our beaches from that due to a lack of food, essentially. Now, this diagram is a lot more complicated to explain, but I'll try and do my best. I know I'm on limited time here, but we looked at a paper recently come out looking at the link between the discharge and sediment load in Cleveland Bay. So again, these are our plots of the seagrass meadow area, and the open circles represent the whole seagrass meadow area, and the enclosed circles represent the shallow subtidal seagrass. So generally a similar pattern, but you can see this is a seagrass meadow area. This next graph is the seagrass meadow biomass. So seagrass is there, but it's not as thick, is essentially the story. And you see it hasn't really recovered since that period of 06, 07, when that first monitoring occurred. The bar graphs at the top, this represents the flow contributions from the different rivers of influence into Cleveland Bay. And you can see there the Burdekin completely dominates the area. And on this bottom panel is our best estimates of the sediment load delivered into Cleveland Bay. So this is taking into account that 80% sediment deposition in the Burdekin, and also the direction of where the plume likely went that year as well. So even factoring in that, the Burdekin is really the dominant flow, the influence in that area. Now, from this, we were able to come up, the authors there were able to come up with a suggested target of the anthropogenic load between about in the order of 35 to 40% to achieve what was defined by our seagrass experts as the desired state. Now, if we focus now in towards the catchment, where is the sediment coming from? We look at, I just want to show sediment budgets from 2 of these big flood years that influenced the Burdekin. So here, this is the contribution of flow for 07, 08 and 08, 09. And this one is what we probably want to look at here is the sediment contributions from the major tributaries of the Burdekin in for 07, 08 and 08, 09 years, right? So we measured the main tributaries upstream of the Burdekin Dam, so the upper Burdekin, the Cape, the Sutter and the Baliendo, and the area below the dam. So we were able to produce our budgets. And we can see in 07, 08, it was really dominated by the area below the dam, and that's where a lot of the focus is in the Triple B, Bowen, Bogey, Broken areas. But however, in the 2008-09 season, we saw a much bigger contribution from the upper Burdekin catchment area, which is the other big source of sediments in the Burdekin. Now, also we factored in the trapping of the Burdekin Falls Dam here, and it reduces. However, when we're looking at that less than 20 micron fraction, this is the trapping of the bulk sediment that's come into the dam. When we're looking at the trapping of the less than 20 micron fraction, it's in these big flood events, it's about 10% less. So there's actually more less than 20 micron fraction going over the dam, and in that year it's probably more like a 60-40 split to the upper Burdekin Triple B. So, and the study that we just come out by Zoe Bainbridge and myself and others, we just showed that we could trace when we had a big flood from the upper Burdekin source, it's those sediments we can trace 100 kilometres plus offshore to that upper Burdekin source. If we had a big flow from the Triple B, the lower Burdekin area, like say after Cyclone Debbie, where the flow was concentrated in there, we can trace that sediment 100 kilometres offshore to the Triple B source. So the key point there is we really need to be managing those two main source areas equally. And if we zoom in, we've done a lot of monitoring with community basis, work with a lot of graziers who've collected their local water quality samples where their streams have been in flood, and we can start to see the areas where we can invest in. So in the upper Burdekin, it's really in this northwestern area in particular, up in that dry river, Grey Creek, Clark River area that's contributing the much larger proportion of the loads. And in the Triple B, I'm just going to move forward because we've also been working very closely with the NQ Dry Tropics landholders driving change process, and we've had a lot of landholders we've been working with there in water quality, collecting their local samples from the creeks, and we're able to start to look at where the higher yielding areas of sediment are in that Triple B a lot better. You can still see we've got some gaps there that we could try and plug, but we haven't found our landholder to sample for us at this stage. But again, the key areas really is contributing the larger fluxes of sediment, loads of sediment in the areas, the Little Bowen tributary and the Rosella Creek arm. So instead of thinking about managing the whole 130,000 square kilometre area, we can now zoom into more of an area of around that sort of 2,000 to 3,000 square kilometre. So narrowing it down a little bit. Now, I think I'm running out of time and I probably not going to have time to go through all of this, but we know a lot about the Burdekin as well. So this is all the measurements we've got from the Burdekin system to put together like a bigger picture catchment to reef story so we can see how the catchment has changed over time, right? So this is everything from our biophysical records, looking at mercury elevation spikes in sediment cores offshore. This is looking at reconstruction of sediment loads, looking at our coral core records, the area of cropping in the Burdekin and how that's changed over time, the mining history of the catchment, the livestock, so the cattle and sheep numbers and how they've changed in the catchment area, the estimated human resident population, the river discharge, including reconstructions from coral cores and our rainfall. So we can put together essentially an environmental history of the Burdekin, and we've been looking at doing this for other basins as well. So that baseline information is there. And this is my summary slide of the management practices of the sediments and particulate nutrients. And it's pretty much similar to the big overarching conclusions. So the land management remediation are most cost effective when we target these hotspots that I've just showed you in the Burdekin. And you can see here, this is an example actually of Strathalbyn Station. These are probably legacy erosion issues that go back to either very early grazing days or even very early mining days in the catchment. So very, very expensive for a landholder to clean up themselves. But we're able to demonstrate really big reductions in the sediment loads from these small areas. So the trick is upscaling at that. And essentially the large-scale remediation of these gullies can reduce sediment exports by more than 90% within only 1 to 2 years. And you can see that massive change in the landscape that's occurred. So, of course, maximising the revegetation of stream banks and channels, and there's been a lot of great work from like land care groups in there, is expected to reduce erosion, but there's quite a gap there of the water quality benefits in that at that stage because it takes a long time to grow trees on riverbanks. To reduce the hill slope erosion issues, management should aim to maintain more than 70% ground cover. Sounds like a very big number, but that also includes like dead biomass on the ground as well. And retention and protection of the existing vegetation, the remnant vegetation in the landscape is obviously very important for reducing erosion as well. And I'll finish it there.